are getting a break from the heat. Those extreme temperatures are still fresh in everybody's mind. So much so, there's a new bill in the city council that would require air conditioning to be provided to all of the city's renters.
So free air conditioners for all the apartments in the city. You know what? This might sound cool, but everyone knows landlords, they're not just going to buy things for people out of the goodness of their hearts. Instead, they're going to get the tens of thousands of dollars needed to outfit every one of their apartments with ACs by jacking up their rents. Only this time, critics say the city will be forcing them to do it during the worst housing crisis we've had in the last 50 years.
You are unlawfully blocking the entrance to this building.
Tonight, some 2 million New Yorkers learned they will have to pay more to live in their rent-stabilized apartments, and some of the tenants did not take the news well at all.
Every year, the rent goes up. They will send us to a shelter, to a family shelter, but I cannot go there with my mother.
Tenant organizations argue that any increase will have devastating consequences for low-income families.
A new bill introduced Thursday would require all New York City landlords to provide air conditioning to their tenants.
Owners cannot afford to do this in many, many buildings.
With the rent that I make from the building, I cannot even pay the utilities.
Landlords who testified argued they're operating at a loss and need to be able to cover basic operating costs.
Tenants who attended the meeting did not hold back their disappointment. Some even took their frustration to the streets.
The increases will affect stabilized leases that begin on or after October 1st.
Rents in this city are now so high, many New Yorkers are effectively prisoners, stuck in apartments they can't move out of. But what nobody's talking about is that things are about to get even worse for renters, because if landlords are forced to buy all kinds of new stuff and include perks that don't normally come with apartments today, the rent tomorrow is just gonna go up. Which is a massive problem considering rents themselves are already unacceptably high, with New York City having the lowest vacancy rate it's had in the last 50 years. And this has created a situation where the only apartments available to be moved into are so expensive, most people can't move into them, which is why many people now feel trapped financially and physically in small apartments they can't leave. Which means growing families cannot stretch their legs, people stop getting married and moving in together, and even professionals with $100,000 a year salaries are forced to live in tiny little rooms just like they did in college, only into their late 30s until they either move out of the city altogether or get some massive raise or win the lottery. And if that doesn't sound bad enough, many landlords say that the rents they're getting aren't enough to pay their bills because the relentless fees, utility costs, and taxes the city requires them to pay are so high, they say the rent has to go even higher. And that brings us to the real reason why critics say we've got rents in this city no one can afford. It's because the government is taking too big a cut out of the housing market at a time when nobody can afford the places they're living in. And they've figured out how to do it while getting tenants to hate their landlords who say that they're in a no-win situation. Yet even now, some of our leaders insist landlords should be spending even more money on their apartments. And although they say it's for health reasons and will save lives, critics say that the plans we've got on the table now are just gonna make more people homeless in the future. So this apartment, it comes with a couple of free air conditioners, and you'd think that that would be normal when you have apartments that cost $7,200 a month. But believe it or not, there are apartments that cost even more than this and don't come with any ACs in them either. And that's because every time a landlord puts an appliance in an apartment, it's then their responsibility to maintain it. The truth is that these were not purchased by the landlord. These were left by the last renters. They are treasure of the New York City rental market. And that's a very important distinction because this apartment, very large, 3 bedrooms, brand new kitchen with a large separate living room. This place is already as affordable as it can get. And if you force landlords to start adding things to apartments and force them to legally maintain those appliances in perpetuity, the costs for renting an apartment are just gonna go up. And when you consider that air conditioners are rather plentiful and people just leave them behind, do we even need such a law? Well, some people unfortunately think that we do.
A new bill introduced Thursday by City Councilman Lincoln Ressler would require all New York City landlords to provide air conditioning to their tenants.
Just as a landlord provides heat in the winter, they should be providing cooling in the summer.
More than 90% of New Yorkers already have AC in their apartments, whether from central air or their own window units. But even still, the health department says about 300...
Look at that. Right there, the neighbors have an AC. In fact, it looks like most people here in this building and throughout the city in general have air conditioners. But even though 90% of apartments in the city have ACs already, the health department's not concerned about that. They're concerned about the 10% that don't have them, and they're also concerned about apartments that may not have enough ACs in every room to keep the temperature at a safe level. And they point out that landlords already have to pay the heat in the wintertime, so it only seems logical that they pay for the AC in the summertime. And the idea that right now there are people living in very small apartments sweltering beyond belief because they don't have an AC isn't something that anyone should feel good about. But although this might sound like a righteous cause worth fighting for, there are some serious problems with the idea that landlords should now be forced to provide enough ACs to keep every single room in every single apartment the right temperature. Because critics say if right now people are sweating when they write their rent checks in the summertime, once the rent goes up, they're gonna be sweating when they write their rent checks every single month of the entire year, and that's the real problem.
And this year, New York City is on pace to be its hottest summer ever.
But there's an extreme cost to inaction, and we have to intervene now as every year it gets hotter and hotter and more people are at risk.
His bill would require landlords keep units below 78 degrees inside when it's above 82 degrees.
Still not cold. So either way, even though it seems like maybe temperatures are rising a little bit every single decade, the real problem with this plan is that we're now going to legally mandate that landlords pay for something and maintain something that a lot of people either leave behind or throw in the trash when they don't need it anymore. That doesn't really sound like a good idea. And if you've got people throwing away their air conditioners, wouldn't it just make more sense to have landlords take those air conditioners and donate them to the city and let them be free for those who don't want to go out and buy one to come and pick up if they still work? That sounds pretty cheap, and it wouldn't mean the rent has to go up. And even if you're buying one, these are pretty affordable. Here's one for $89. That'll cool a room. But air conditioners, they're massive, they're heavy. I can understand that not everybody who wants one would be able to physically get one into their apartment and set it up safely. But that's not the real issue with this plan. The real issue is that it's going to require that the rooms in a given apartment be a specific temperature. So like right here, we've got a kitchen window which doesn't have an AC in it. How do you even abide by that requirement here? Perhaps you would need ACs in the other rooms that are keeping those cool. You'll have some air traveling in here, and then maybe up here, maybe at the top of this window, you could get yourself a small AC. But luckily this kitchen, which is all brand new by the way, and has a little dishwasher, it's in the interior of the building. So the windows that we have here, they're not facing the street where they're getting direct sunlight, which is gonna heat them up. And here's the other problem that nobody's talking about. Every single appliance in an apartment, it has to be maintained by the property owner and kept in good working order. Most leases stipulate that, like this brand new washer and dryer right here. Now, it's not that landlords don't want to spend money on stuff that makes their apartments better and more valuable, like laundry. I mean, you can't just go get your own laundry and put it in an apartment. That requires special technical work to be done to the apartment so that it can even fit and vent out. And for that reason, landlords probably aren't going to go find a bunch of used air conditioners and leave them in the apartments. If it becomes a law that every place has to have one, they're going to buy brand new ones. Probably like this Amazon Basics AC right here for $165. 5 rooms, AC in each room. That's $825 for an apartment like this. If you do that 10 times, you're looking at 10 grand. And just because someone owns an apartment, that doesn't mean that they're super rich. Not every single landlord is going to be able to eat that cost. Some are going to have to pass it along to their renters. And when those ACs break, it just makes the whole process of being a landlord tougher.
Owners cannot afford to do this in many, many buildings.
Frank Ricci is Executive Vice President of the Rent Stabilization Association, representing about 25,000 New York City landlords.
If they're really serious about doing this, it's got to be carbon neutral and it's got to be revenue.
So I think Frank here just killed this whole plan by saying it's got to be carbon neutral because more people using ACs would increase people's carbon footprints, and there are groups that would be very opposed to such a policy. But aside from that, what if your landlord decides to save money and he gets the cheapest ACs he can find on the internet? What if the window units he provides you with are so weak they don't adequately cool the place down? Or what if they make noise and they make it uncomfortable to be in the apartment and try to sleep at night? Are you even allowed to remove the ACs provided by the landlord and put your own in? Where do you store them in a small apartment? This is going to complicate something that's not really that complicated right now. And that brings up a big question. How come we're not talking about plans that would lower people's rents to help them survive in their apartments and buy their own ACs if they want them for every single room if they want? That would be a real plan that would have a lasting impact. Yet for some reason, we're not hearing about plans like that, are we? Man, is it any question of how bad the housing situation here really is? In fact, it's so bad, even the city's rent-stabilized apartments, which have an artificial rent ceiling, even those are now so expensive, the people who have them, the lucky few, even they say rents are at levels they cannot afford, which proves we've got a massive disaster on our hands.
Tonight, some 2 million New Yorkers learned they will have to pay more to live in their rent-stabilized apartments, and some of the tenants did not take the news well at all. Police made several arrests as dozens of people who will be impacted protested outside of Hunter College as the Rent Guidelines Board.
So if anything, this protest proves that the real conversation we should be having here is how do we get people's rents to go the opposite direction of the direction that they're headed? Clearly, the people that are here protesting, they're less concerned about having an air conditioner that they need for 3 months out of a year than having rent that they can afford all 12 months of the year. Yet many of the folks that are at that protest who are upset that the city is allowing landlords to raise their rent, they don't realize that this is the same city that's made things so expensive for those landlords they really have no choice. And it's also the very same city that makes it impossible to build new buildings which would lower housing costs. Now, are New York City landlords saints? No, of course they want to make money. Of course they want to run the most successful, profit-driven business that they possibly can. But at the same time, nothing is being done by our leaders to give them increased competition. Like, why is there an empty lot here with tall grass growing in it? Why is there no building here? That's a great question. But not only would increased housing inventory help lower prices for everybody, another thing that would help would be if landlords weren't mandated to do so many different things. And here's an example. If you rent a commercial space like this ice cream store right here, you've got to pay for the utilities and you've also got to pay for the water usage. But if you rent one of the apartments upstairs from the ice cream shop, the landlord has to provide the water for you. That right there gives this business a big incentive to lower their water consumption so that it remains affordable and helps them do their job. But the people living upstairs from the ice cream shop, they're under no such incentive to be efficient with their water usage. That doesn't mean that they're water hogs, but it does mean the landlords are probably paying more for water than the water bill would be if tenants were responsible for it. Plus, the city recently introduced a new tax on water usage, which means landlords are paying more for the water that gets used in apartments than they were in the past, revealing that if your rent is higher than you wish it was, it's partly the landlord's fault, but it's also partly the fault of the city itself.
Board members were heckled by stabilized tenants over a proposed rent hike.
Every year the rent goes up, they will send us to a shelter, to a family shelter, but I cannot go there with my mother. My mother is bedbound with 24 hours home.
So the real issue here is that you have people living in apartments they can barely afford to rent, yet at the exact same time, those apartments are owned by people who can barely afford to fix them. That's the real problem. No one's winning here. Everyone's losing. And even though it's incredibly sad to hear that someone who has nothing may have to leave their apartment and live in a shelter, it's not like every landlord that owns a property here is Scrooge McDuck sleeping on a pile of money every single evening. And it's not like being a landlord in the New York City rental market is a get-rich-quick scheme. It's not, especially when there are laws here that protect tenants who might do things to lower a landlord's income, like squat in an apartment and not take money out of their bank account to pay the rent every month like they're supposed to. Those are called squatters, and the reason we have a problem with them here is because you can live in a place for 6 months to a year before an eviction proceeding even gets finalized. And that right there is another problem that isn't necessarily caused by tenants, it's caused by the laws that landlords and tenants have to function under.
Landlords argue the increases are necessary to keep up with basic operating costs.
Without them, owners can't keep up with spiking insurance premiums, property taxes, mandates from City Hall that require things like reducing our carbon footprint and basic safety.
Okay, utility charges, insurance, environmental mandates, these things are expensive. And look, these buildings, they're not exactly brand new. It's hard to have 2024 environmental standards applied to stuff that was built in 1904. But even though many of these buildings are old and charming to look at, do you ever wonder why they're the only types of buildings around? Like why, for example, is everything here hundreds of years old? There's nothing modern. And when you do happen to see a recently constructed building here, why is it just as short as every other building here? Well, that's because our laws make it way too expensive to build new buildings. Oh no, it's cheaper to keep the old ones and just try and maintain them year after year after year until they fall down. And if something does happen to one of these buildings, you can't just rebuild whatever you want on the same plot of land. Oh no. No, in fact, the rules say that whatever was there before has to be put back. So it's going to be the same height, it's going to be the same size, and that's why this new building here is as tall as every other building on the block.
In a statement, Mayor Eric Adams said in part, "We are grateful for the board's careful consideration of the data and their decision to limit increases this year. As we have said from day one, the only way to ultimately lower rents is to build more housing." So Mayor Adams, 110% correct. More apartments would fix our housing situation, yet getting them and not having buildings like this everywhere, it's just not happening. And that's because if you try to build anything in this city, you've got to go
go through massive environmental reviews, which take a long time and are expensive. Certainly, we don't want to damage the environment here, but there's not really much environment left. It's a concrete city at this point. Either way, the process is very slow. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. And we're now in a situation where many New Yorkers are virtually trapped because the costs to get out of an apartment that you can't afford are actually more than just toughing it out and paying higher rent every single year, year after year after year after year. And according to this study here, it's going to cost the average person about $10,000 to make a move. And let's face it, most people who are living paycheck to paycheck in apartments that are way overpriced, they don't have $10,000 to get out of a situation like that. And even when people do have those upfront costs, this same article reveals that only 5% of the apartments available are even able to be rented by people who make the city's average wage, which is around $75,000 a year in annual income. That's your middle class. But the middle class right now is trapped in this city. They can't move out of the apartments that they're in. The new apartments that are out there, they can't afford. All the while, costs of those apartments just keep going up. And they could go even higher if we don't abandon plans that make landlords pay for things that people would probably be better off supplying on their own if their rents were lower to begin with. What do you think about that? Should landlords be forced to provide AC? It would definitely be nice, but is that going to help the overall rent situation? Should we instead turn our energy towards lowering rents somehow? How would you do that? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.